It was a chilly morning in early March when the first call came into the small-town animal control center. A delivery driver had noticed a dog curled up on a tattered piece of fabric near a dumpster behind an abandoned building. He wasn't barking or moving around, just laying there, guarding something frayed and muddy. "He won't let anyone near the blanket," the caller had said. "It's like it's all he's got." Officer Dana, a seasoned member of the animal control team, didn't think much of it at first. Stray dogs were common, especially in forgotten corners of town where life moved slowly and people easily overlooked suffering. But something in the man's voice stuck with her, a kind of quiet heartbreak. She grabbed her coat, keys, and the standard rescue kit, then headed toward the outskirts of RIDGEVIEW. As she pulled up beside the alleyway, Dana caught sight of the dog almost immediately. He was thin, terrifyingly so, with ribs poking through fur that had once been thick and golden but was now matted with dirt. His eyes were dull, tired, but not aggressive. He didn't bark when Dana approached. He didn't growl or snarl. He just looked at her with a gaze so heavy. It rooted her to the spot, and there it was, the blanket. A faded piece of blue fleece, torn at the corners and stained from weather and time. The dog had it wrapped beneath him like a treasure. Every time Dana moved closer, he would gently mouth the edge of the blanket, dragging it closer to his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. "Hey there, buddy." Dana crouched low, her voice soft as wind through pine. "You don't need to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't run. He didn't seem capable of it. Instead, he just pressed his head into the blanket, shielding his face like a child might bury their tears in a pillow. It was that gesture, so human, so desperately sorrowful, that made Dana's heart crack. She tried food, tossing small bits of beef jerky near him, but he didn't eat. She set out a small bowl of water and waited. He sniffed it once but didn't drink. Hours passed. The sun climbed high and started to dip again, casting shadows across the bricks. Still, Dana waited. Eventually, she spoke not as a rescuer, but as a woman who had her own bruised history with loss. She told the dog about the old beagle she used to have as a child, how he'd wait at the front door every day after school. She told him about losing her mom, about how she'd kept her mother's scarf in her closet for years, unable to part with the smell, the memory. "I get it," she whispered. "It's not just a blanket to you. It's your story. It's who you loved." By nightfall, Dana gently inched closer. This time, the dog didn't flinch when her hand touched the frayed corner of the fleece. He looked at her with tired acceptance, as if he finally understood she wasn't there to take it away, just to offer him something else. She named him Rusty. Back at the shelter, Rusty was given a soft, warm bed, fresh food, and medical attention. But no matter what they did, he refused to sleep without his blanket. The shelter staff let him keep it, tucking it beneath his bed like a holy relic. Every night, he curled around it. And every morning, he'd wake with his paw draped protectively over it, eyes flicking toward the door, hoping for something no one could see. A week passed. Then, too, Rusty began to eat a little more. His eyes regained a glimmer of light, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd wag his tail when someone kind entered the room. But the blanket never left his side. They tried washing it once gently, carefully, but Rusty had howled in panic until it was returned. He sniffed every inch of it before finally laying down again, chest rising and falling in slow relief. It was during one of the routine medical checks that Dana noticed something sewn into the corner of the fabric. The initials M+R stitched in faded red thread. Her breath caught. "Rusty," she murmured. Was it her blanket? Was it hers? The staff began to piece together what they could. Rusty had once belonged to someone who had loved him deeply. A woman, perhaps. Maybe a young girl. Someone who had cared enough to give him that blanket and mark it as something shared between them. But where was she now? Why had Rusty been found alone in a cold alley, holding on to the only piece of her left? No one could answer those questions. Not yet. But the ache in Rusty's eyes told everyone at the shelter that whatever had happened, it had changed him. It had broken something inside that only time and love might be able to heal. The townsfolk who visited the shelter often stopped by Rusty's kennel. He was gentle and calm, never aggressive, but rarely playful. He'd let children pet him, adults feed him, and volunteers walk him, but he always returned to his blanket. Always. One day, a family came in looking to adopt. They had 2 young kids and had recently lost their older dog to cancer. The mother knelt beside Rusty and smiled softly. "He's beautiful," she said. "So sweet." The boy leaned in to touch the blanket, but Rusty stood, gently nudging it back under him. Not a warning, just a plea. "Please." Not that. Dana shook her head gently. "He's not ready," she whispered. "He's still waiting." That night, Dana sat beside Rusty after hours. She didn't say much, just sat in silence, both of them surrounded by the hush of the shelter, the quiet humming of fluorescent lights above. Rusty leaned against her leg. His blanket was beneath him. His heart, though still grieving, had found a small flicker of peace. Because maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. 2 weeks had passed since Rusty arrived at the Ridgeview shelter, and while his appetite had improved and his fur was slowly regaining some of its shine, one thing hadn't changed: his devotion to the blanket. He wouldn't sleep without it, wouldn't rest unless it was nearby. And although he had started to tolerate the gentle touch of humans again, he remained distant, like his soul was somewhere far away, lost in a memory he couldn't share. Dana had spent more time with him than with any other dog at the shelter. Every night after her shift, she'd sit outside his kennel, watching him chew gently on the corner of the blanket, sometimes whining softly, other times just staring into space. There was something sacred about that old fabric. She began to wonder, what if it was more than just comfort? What if there was a story inside that blanket waiting to be discovered? One morning, when the shelter was quiet and the dogs were napping, after breakfast, Dana brought in a cup of coffee and quietly sat down by Rusty's kennel. He looked up and wagged his tail once, slowly, acknowledging her presence. His paw rested on the blanket, possessive but calm. "I'm not trying to take it," Dana whispered with a soft smile. "I just want to understand." She waited until he laid his head back down before she pulled on a pair of gloves and reached through the bars, not to touch Rusty, but to gently examine the far corner of the fleece. She'd seen the stitched initials M+R before, but today she noticed something different. The hem had come loose, just slightly, and something stiff and crumpled was hidden inside the lining. Her hands trembled as she eased it free, a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and spotted with mildew. She glanced at Rusty, who now watched her with cautious eyes. "It's okay," she said gently. "I'll give it right back." She unfolded the fragile paper, revealing faded blue ink written in shaky handwriting. It was short, simple, and devastating. "To my Rusty, if you ever get lost or I can't find you, hold on to this. I'll be looking. I promise. Love always, Maddie." Dana felt the weight of the letter in her chest like a boulder. She looked up at Rusty, tears already brimming in her eyes. "Maddie?" she breathed. "You loved him, didn't you? You really loved him." The letter told her everything she needed to know. The blanket hadn't been just comfort. It was a symbol of a bond so strong that even after being torn apart, it hadn't broken. Maddie had prepared Rusty for the worst, and in some way, she had trusted he would survive. Dana knew she had to find her. That afternoon, she photocopied the note and carefully sewed the original back into the lining of the blanket. Rusty watched the entire time, and when Dana gently pushed the fabric back toward him, he lowered his head and breathed into it, as if recognizing the scent of a memory dot with the copy in hand. Dana drove to the local library and sat down with the town's old public records and social media archives. It wasn't much to go on, just a first name and a dog's, but Ridgeview wasn't a big town. Maddie and Rusty, Mum plus R. That kind of love didn't just disappear. Hours passed. Names blurred together. But then she found it, a fundraiser page from 2 years ago titled, "Help Maddie and Rusty Find a Home Together." The photo on the page made Dana stop breathing for a second. There was Rusty younger, fuller, and beaming beside a teenage girl with long dark curls and a wide smile. Her arms were wrapped tightly around him, and they both looked like they belonged to each other in a way most people could only dream of. The caption read, "My name is Maddie. Rusty is my whole world. We've been living in my car since my mom passed, and shelters won't let me keep him. Please, anything helps. I won't leave him behind." Donna's heart shattered. She clicked deeper, but the fundraiser had ended suddenly. No updates, no closure. But now she knew Rusty hadn't been abandoned because someone stopped loving him. He'd been separated from the one person who probably loved him more than life itself. The next few days were a blur. Dana couldn't shake the photo from her mind or the look in Rusty's eyes every time someone new walked by. He was still waiting. For Maddie, she called local organizations, posted in community Facebook groups, and even reached out to shelters in neighboring towns. Most leads went nowhere. Too old, too vague, no matches. But she didn't give up. Meanwhile, Rusty began to change, just a little. He started walking to the kennel door when he heard Dana's voice. He'd nuzzle into her palm instead of pulling away. And once, after she returned from a long day of searching, he licked her hand and rested his chin on her knee. Blanket still clutched beneath his belly. "You're helping me look for her, huh?" Dana whispered, petting him gently. "We'll find her. I promise." One evening, after nearly a week of silence, Dana received a message from a social worker in a nearby town. It was short, but it made her heart stop. "I worked with a teen named Maddie 2 years ago. She lost her dog when she was taken into foster care. She still talks about him. Can we talk?" Tears streamed down Dana's face as she looked over at Rusty, who lay curled up in his usual spot, nose buried in the corner of the blanket. She stood up and unlocked his kennel door. He raised his head, confused. "Rusty," she said, kneeling beside him, "I think we might have found her." His ears perked up. The very next day, Dana met with the social worker who confirmed that Maddie had been placed into a group home out of town. She was now 18, working a part-time job and attending community college. And yes, she still talked about Rusty as if he were the missing piece of her heart. "She used to sleep with that same blanket," the woman said softly. They were inseparable. Dana couldn't stop the tears. It all made sense now. Rusty had never stopped waiting because Maddie had never stopped loving him. That night, Dana sat beside Rusty and whispered, "We found her, boy. We found Maddie." Rusty's eyes glistened, and for the first time since he arrived, he let out a soft, hopeful whimper, not out of fear or pain, but something that sounded like longing, something that sounded like hope. The next morning dawned cold and misty, the kind of quiet that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Dana didn't sleep well. Her mind had been racing with thoughts of Maddie, of Rusty, of how the universe had somehow managed to keep a fragile thread between two souls for this long without snapping. It felt like fate had given her a task, and it was now up to her to see it through. When she arrived at the shelter, Rusty was already awake. As soon as he heard her footsteps, he slowly stood up and padded toward the gate of his kennel, tail wagging ever so slightly. His blanket was still with him, clenched softly in his mouth. Dana knelt beside him and whispered, "You ready to go see her, boy?" She swore he understood. His eyes widened, and he leaned his body against the gate like he wanted to walk through it. Dana chuckled through her tears and opened the latch. He stepped out slowly but didn't run. He walked beside her like he had been doing it his whole life. In the office, Dana made the call. Maddie was staying temporarily in a small group home, an hour and a half away, under the guidance of a nonprofit that helped foster kids transition to independence. The director, a kind woman named April, had spoken with Maddie about Rusty the night before. "She didn't believe me at first," April had said on the phone. "When I showed her the picture, she broke down. Said she thought he was gone forever." Now they were arranging a visit. April had asked if it could happen the very next day. "She's been carrying that loss like a weight around her chest," she said. "If this really is him, it'll change everything for her." Dana looked at Rusty, resting at her feet with his head on the blanket. "It's him," she said softly. "It's always been him." That evening, Dana prepared for the trip like she was getting ready to reunite two broken parts of a whole heart. She packed a small bag with Rusty's essentials, his food, his water bowl, his medical records, and most importantly, the blanket. She didn't even try to separate it from him. He carried it out to the van himself, holding it gently in his mouth as if afraid it would vanish if he let it go. The following morning, they left just after sunrise. The roads were quiet. Rusty sat calmly in the back seat, gazing out the window, his blanket tucked beneath his chest like a secret treasure. Dana glanced back at him every few minutes, her own chest tight with anticipation. She couldn't stop thinking about what Maddie must be feeling if she'd slept, if she'd cried, if she believed this was really happening. At exactly 8:47 a.m., they pulled into the driveway of the group home, a modest white building nestled beside a grove of trees, its porch painted light blue with a wooden swing hanging gently from a chain. Dana parked and took a deep breath. "We're here," she whispered. Rusty didn't move right away. He stared out the window like he was scanning for something. Then he turned and looked at Dana, eyes wide and alert. She opened the door and helped him out, holding the leash loosely as they made their way to the porch. Before she could even knock, the front door opened. There she stood, Maddie. She was older than in the fundraiser photo, no longer a child, but her eyes held the same ache Dana had seen in Rusty. Her hands trembled at her sides, and her voice cracked when she said his name. "Rusty?" He froze. Something passed between them, something invisible but undeniable. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and then, as if lightning struck through years of sorrow, he let out a sound that Dana would never forget, a cry. Deep and soulful, like the cry of someone who had wandered too far from home and finally saw the front porch again. He bolted. Not with fear, with purpose. He ran straight to Maddie, blanket still clutched in his mouth, tail wagging uncontrollably. She dropped to her knees as he crashed into her arms, and in that moment, the world around them melted into nothing. Just a girl and her dog, reunited after heartbreak, after homelessness, after fate had pulled them apart and pushed them back together. Maddie wrapped her arms around his neck and sobbed into his fur. "I thought I lost you," she cried. "I thought I lost you forever." Rusty whined softly, licking her cheek, nudging her face with his nose. He dropped the blanket beside her, placing a paw gently over it, as if to say, "You left this with me, and I kept it safe." Dana turned away, wiping tears from her eyes. She wasn't the only one. April and two other house staff members stood silently nearby, tears running down their cheeks. It was a moment that didn't need words, it spoke for itself. The reunion of two hearts that never stopped beating for each other. They sat there on the porch for what felt like hours. Maddie didn't stop touching him, her hands running through his fur, her lips pressed against his head, whispering things only Rusty could understand. He never looked away from her. Not once. When they finally moved inside, Dana sat down with Maddie and told her everything. How Rusty had been found with the blanket, how he refused to let it go, how he waited by the door every day. Maddie listened, tears silently falling as she clutched the blanket to her chest. "I gave it to him the night before we were taken," she said softly. "They said I couldn't keep him, that he'd be taken to a different place. I was afraid I'd never see him again, so I wrapped him in my blanket and told him to wait for me. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try." Dana reached over and took her hand. It did work. He waited. He never stopped waiting. Maddie hugged Rusty again, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'm so sorry you were alone, baby. But I'm here now. I'm here." Rusty nuzzled her and then gently laid his head in her lap and fell asleep. Safe, whole, home. The rest of the day passed quietly. April confirmed that Maddie was in a stable situation, nearly finished with the program, and was planning to move into a small studio apartment next month. When Dana asked if she would be able to adopt Rusty permanently, April smiled and said, "That's all she's ever wanted." When Dana left, she paused at the door and looked back. Maddie was sitting on the floor, stroking Rusty's fur, the blanket between them like a bridge they had both crossed to find each other again. "Thank you," Maddie said, voice thick with emotion. "For bringing him back," Dana smiled, eyes shining. "He never left you. He was just waiting." The days following Rusty and Maddie's reunion felt like time had slowed to allow them the space to rebuild the life they had once been forced to abandon. Every sunrise brought a little more light to the dim parts of Maddie's heart. Every sunset closed a day that ended not in sadness, but with the peaceful rhythm of a dog's breathing at her feet. Maddie had been changed by the years apart. Life in foster care hadn't been easy. She had grown stronger, yes, but guarded too wary of hope, skeptical of permanence. For so long, everything had been temporary. Shelter beds, shared rooms, unfamiliar faces, promises that never held. But Rusty was not temporary. He was the one constant in her stormy life. Even separated by time and space, he had clung to her memory in the form of that old blanket. Now that he was back, it was as though the piece of her heart that had gone missing had finally found its way home. Rusty, too, began to transform. No longer thin or skittish, his energy returned in waves, tentative at first, like a dog waking from a long winter, but then bolder with each passing day. He followed Maddie everywhere, from the kitchen to the yard, from the front porch to her bed. He no longer whimpered in his sleep. He no longer hid his blanket away from sight. He still kept it close, but now it was folded beside his bed rather. Then clutched like a life raft, one crisp Saturday morning, Maddie took Rusty to the park. It was their first real outing together since the reunion, and she had spent the night before gathering all the little things he'd need, his leash, his favorite chew toy, and of course, the blanket. She tucked it into her backpack just in case. She didn't want him to feel lost, not even for a second dot as they walked through the autumn leaves. The world seemed to lean in and listen. The wind whispered through the trees. Children laughed in the distance. And Rusty trotted beside her with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there in years. Maddie smiled as she watched him sniff at bushes, wag his tail at passing joggers, and chase after a falling leaf with puppy-like delight. For a moment, she let herself crying not out of sadness, but from the sheer beauty of having something back that she thought was lost forever. Rusty noticed. He paused and looked at her, those deep brown eyes filled with concern. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I'm okay," she whispered. "These are happy tears, buddy. You're home. We made it." Rusty licked her cheek and wagged his tail. They sat on a park bench for a long time, Maddie running her fingers through his fur, her backpack resting at her side with the blanket peeking out. She pulled it free and laid it across her lap. Rusty immediately perked up, placing one paw on it and curling against her legs as if to say, It's still ours. It always will be. Nearby, an elderly woman watched them from her bench. She smiled softly and approached. "Beautiful dog," she said gently. "Thank you," Maddie replied, stroking Rusty's head. "I saw the way he looked at you." Woman said, "That's a kind of love you don't see every day." Maddie nodded, tears threatening again. "We were separated for a long time. I thought I'd never see him again." "But he waited," the woman said knowingly. "Dogs do that. They remember the ones who gave them their heart." After a quiet pause, she added, "You're lucky." Maddie smiled. "I know." That night, back at the group home, Maddie and Rusty curled up together on her bed. The room wasn't fancy, just a twin mattress, a desk, and a small window, but it felt like the safest place in the world now. Rusty slept curled in a tight ball beside her, his body pressed close. She rested the blanket over both of them like a fragile bridge that had finally led them home. The next morning brought a knock at the door. April, the house director, peeked in and smiled. "Hey Maddie, you've got a visitor." Dana stood in the hallway, holding a bag of supplies and a warm smile. Maddie's eyes lit up. "I brought some things for Rusty," Dana said, "and I wanted to see how you two were doing." Rusty recognized her immediately and trotted over, tail wagging. He nuzzled her legs and licked her hands affectionately. "He remembers you," Maddie said, amazed. Dana laughed softly. "We spent a lot of quiet nights at the shelter, this boy and me, but he was always looking for you." They sat down in the common room while Rusty curled up near the sofa. Dana handed Maddie a small photo book. Inside were pictures of Rusty during his time at the shelter. The first day he arrived, his cautious eyes, the way he clung to the blanket like a lifeline. Maddie flipped through the pages slowly, a lump forming in her throat. She reached the final photo. Rusty curled up beside the torn blanket, eyes closed but body tense, and felt her heart break all over again. "He never gave up," Dana said softly. "Even when we didn't know who he was waiting for, he did. He always knew." Maddie wiped her eyes and looked up. "Thank you for not giving up on him, for helping us find each other again." Dana placed a hand on her shoulder. He held onto that blanket because it reminded him of love. You were never far from his heart. In the following weeks, Maddie prepared for her move into the studio apartment. It wasn't much, a single-room unit above a bakery, but it was hers. Her own space. A place where Rusty could have his own bed, his own corner, and his own routine. She visited every day before moving in, setting up his food bowl, laying down the blanket in a special spot near the window where he liked to sunbathe. On moving day, she knelt beside him, held the blanket close, and whispered, "We're going home, Rusty, for real this time." He wagged his tail and barked softly, nudging her cheek with his nose. That night, Maddie placed the blanket in the center of the living room. Rusty lay down on it, sighed deeply, and looked up at her with the calm contentment of someone who had finally, after all the storms and all the waiting, come home. Maddie sat beside him, pulled the blanket over her legs, and whispered, "I think we're going to be okay." And in the flicker of lamplight, surrounded by warmth, silence, and years of longing finally fulfilled, a girl and her dog fell asleep together, whole, healing. The first morning in Maddie's new apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the bakery below and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. But to Maddie, it felt like the beginning of a brand new chapter, the first one not written in grief or fear, but in hope. She lay on her mattress in the corner of the small room, curled up under a worn quilt. At her feet, nestled on his precious torn blanket, was Rusty, his body rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in a golden hue. Rusty stirred first, opening one sleepy eye and looking around as if to remind himself this wasn't a dream. His gaze fell on Maddie, and his tail thumped softly against the floor. She opened her eyes, smiled, and reached out to scratch behind his ears. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she whispered. Rusty yawned and stretched, his paws tapping the blanket, his anchor through every storm. Though it had frayed even more at the edges, though its color had faded, the blanket still held a magic, still smelled like memories, still wrapped him in the comfort of a girl's love when the world had turned its back. Maddie rose, careful not to disturb him too much, and padded to the kitchen nook. She poured some kibble into his bowl and then made herself a cup of instant coffee. There wasn't much in the apartment, just a couch she found at a thrift store, a second-hand table, and the mattress on the floor, but it didn't matter. Because Rusty was here. Because her heart was no longer fractured. They fell into a rhythm quickly. Morning walks before work. Lazy afternoons in the window light. Rusty would greet her every evening with a joyful bark, always carrying his blanket like a welcome home banner. Neighbors quickly took notice. The woman who ran the bakery downstairs began leaving dog treats near the door. A boy down the hall would stop and sit with Rusty while Maddie was out running errands. One day, a local artist even sketched a portrait of Rusty resting on his torn blanket, which now hung proudly on the living room wall. Despite the simplicity of their life, happiness bloomed in unexpected places. Maddie started painting again, something she hadn't done since the days before foster care. Inspired by Rusty, she began creating illustrations of dogs in all kinds of scenes, lost dogs finding their way, abandoned pups discovering new homes, old dogs being loved in their final days. She started sharing them online, never expecting much. But one post changed everything. It was a drawing of Rusty on his blanket, titled "The Dog Who Waited." It went viral. People from around the world were moved by the story, the image of a dog so loyal, so broken yet unbreakable, holding on to a single piece of fabric because it was all he had left of the one he loved. Maddie wrote the caption from her heart. "He never let go of the blanket I gave him the day we were separated. Years later, it's still his most treasured thing, because it reminded him of me. Dogs don't forget love. They wait for it to find them again." Thousands of comments poured in. Rescue groups, dog lovers, and even shelters shared their own stories. Offers came in for commissions, collaborations, even interviews. But Maddie kept her focus small. She used the attention to support local shelters, including the one where Dana had found Rusty. She created a fundraiser to help other animals still waiting, with their own torn blankets and silent hopes. Rusty, of course, didn't care about the fame. All he wanted was his routine, his girl, his naps, his walks, and his blanket. As long as those remained, his heart was full. But time, as it does, continued moving forward. Years passed. The lines on Maddie's face deepened with age, and Rusty's once bright eyes grew cloudier. His walks became slower, his naps longer. The torn blanket, now patched and framed in a shadow box on the wall, was still taken down every night for him to sleep with. Maddie had tried replacing it once with a newer, softer one, but Rusty ignored it completely, gently dragging his old piece of cloth back to his bed like an heirloom no one else could understand. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted past the window, Maddie sat beside Rusty on the couch. He had grown frail, his body thinning with age. He lay with his head in her lap, breathing slowly. She stroked his fur, her other hand holding the blanket against his chest. "You can rest now," she whispered, eyes misting. "You found me. You waited so long, and now you can sleep knowing you were never forgotten. I love you, Rusty, always." He let out a long sigh, his eyes blinking slowly, as if savoring the sound of her voice one last time. Later that night, Rusty passed away in his sleep, wrapped in the same blanket that had once carried the scent of a little girl's love through years of abandonment. The grief was a storm Maddie hadn't prepared for. Her world felt hollow without his footsteps, without the way he greeted her each morning, without his quiet presence beside her bed. But more than anything, it was the silence around the blanket that broke her. She would sit beside it every night, now resting beneath the framed sketch and his photo, and whisper stories of their journey just to keep him close. And yet, even in her sorrow, Maddie knew Rusty's legacy would live on. She began working full-time as an illustrator, dedicating her art to rescue dogs and their stories. She started a nonprofit called The Blanket Project, which provided comfort items, blankets, toys, and love to shelter animals across the country. Each one came with a note: "You are not forgotten. You are not alone." People donated in Rusty's name. His story was shared at adoption events, schools, and community centers. Children drew pictures of dogs with blankets and wrote letters to their pets thanking them for their loyalty. Maddie watched it all unfold, her heart both aching and whole. Years later, on what would have been Rusty's 10th birthday, Maddie stood in front of a group of children at a local shelter. She held up the worn blanket, now kept in a glass case, and told him about a dog who never let go, not of hope, not of love, not of her Dot. And then she smiled through her tears and said, "He waited for me when the world forgot us. He taught me that love is never really lost, it just waits. Sometimes with a torn blanket, and always with a faithful heart." In the quiet that followed, a little girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you think he knows how much you loved him?" Maddie knelt beside her, eyes soft and certain. "I think he always knew." And somewhere, in the invisible space between now and memory, a dog named Rusty ran through fields of golden light, his torn blanket trailing behind him like a banner of all the love he had given and received.